International Trauma Advocacy and Croatian Veteran Politics.
Okay, thank you very much. At the beginning of the week, Slobodna Dalmatia newspaper reported on yet another round of company closures in Croatia. And strikingly, the report talks about bankruptcy trauma and fears the impact of intergenerational traumatic impact. And the sacked workers are being offered trauma counselling by the Zagreb Culture of Peace and Non-Violence Centre. I think for me that sort of pretty much sums up 20 years of post-Cold War state building in the Balkans. But anyway, I suppose I'd better get on with my fill out the detail of that. This month we've got a whole series of sort of 20 years anniversaries in Bosnia, etc. What I find really striking in these anniversaries and sort of looking at things 20 years on, the key themes of sort of state building as mourning or counselling, or what I've called state building as therapeutic governance. And what I argue in this paper looking at Croatian veterans, that what we see is state building as a form of therapeutic governance, where we have therapeutic forms of relationships developing, therapeutic forms of legitimising. Again, when we look at therapeutic governance in its different forms, whether it's in Britain, the US, or whether we look in Southeast Europe, we can see certain overlapping themes, but also certain distinctions between Bosnia, Croatia, Serbia, Kosovo, etc. But what I would argue is we can identify a broad theme relating to the populations in terms of a sort of sick role. Now, I can't remember from my A-level history, but there was some country that was called the sick man of Europe. But sorry, the Ottoman Empire. But yeah. But actually, what one sees today is a much broader theme of the sort of sick populations globally. And that what one sees is not a relationship to the demos as a demos, but as the patient, or in the context of strikingly in sort of the post-socialist states, not relating to the demos as workers, but relating to the demos as the incapacitated. I'm a bit into Shakespeare at the moment. Sonnet 66 talks about treating people as if they're constraining people in terms of as if they have a limp. All right. So if we look at, as I say, my paper is looking at Croatia and Croatian state building. Quite strikingly, the Croatian state itself, in terms of how it sort of relates to, sees itself, quite strikingly, Croatia sees itself and contrasts itself, whereas Yugoslavia saw itself as a socialist state, it defines itself as the social state. Or one can translate that as the welfare state, if you look at the Croatian constitution. So I think there's interesting themes that Patricia or Dave might want to pick up about, or Jonathan, about the social, the understanding of the social when it comes to Croatia. All right, so when we look at international, when we look at the therapeutic, when we look at trauma advocacy, Croatia makes a really interesting, or for me anyway, interesting case study, because it was the first country where international trauma and psychosocial programs took off in the early 1990s. Essentially it took off as part of post-Cold War conflict management. We have psychosocial programs seeking to break cycles of trauma and violence, and you had that shift away from a Clausewitzian understanding of war to a sort of psychosocial understanding of war, of dysfunctional cultures and personalities. And here we can note the significance of the Harvard program in refugee trauma playing a significant role in promoting Western therapeutic models in the region. So it developed a Harvard trauma questionnaire. It developed a specific one, not just in relation to Croatian refugees, but a specific one for Croatian veterans. And its training programs have been supported by the Stability Pact, the World Bank, Open Society, USAID, etc. In one sense, we can see Croatia adopting Western trauma models in the context of a broader Croatian orientation towards the West. But think more specifically, we need to look at its adoption, the adoption of a therapeutic framework, and in particular a therapeutic framework towards veterans. We need to consider it in relation to the relationship with Croatian nationalism. So if we understand nationalism as struggle for self-determination, we might think of it in terms of sort of a Nietzschean will to power and sovereignty. In many respects, nationalism may be seen as antithetical to a trauma model of dysfunction and incapacity. If we look at Talcott Parsons on the Sikh role, he talks about the Sikh role as representing a release from self-determination and responsibility. So in that respect, therapeutic models can be seen as antithetical to nationalism, or in other words, Croatian nationalism can be seen as antithetical to therapeutic models. And in that sense, Croatian nationalism initially circumscribed therapeutic frameworks. Indeed, President Tudjman, there's aspects of President Tudjman, who was an old-fashioned nationalist, as a former Yugoslav partisan officer. He was very much, he was reported as being wary of trauma labels in relation to Croatian soldiers, that he saw their suffering, Croatian soldiers suffering in the Homeland War, as heroic suffering, not dysfunctional. That it was a heroic Homeland War, and therefore they shouldn't be given labels linked to a Vietnam syndrome, which was linked to an unpopular, dirty war, and therefore post-traumatic stress disorder, in a certain sense, was insulting to apply to Croatian soldiers. However, the adoption of trauma models within Croatia relates to the sort of dualistic form, I would argue, the dualistic aspect to state legitimisation in Croatia, that it's got both require both domestic and international legitimation. What James Gow has talked about Croatia's sort of Janus-like political discourse. On the one hand, part of international legitimisation involved an emphasis on Croatia as a victim externally, but if you look at internal discourse, it was around being a victor internally. So it's in this dualism of a sort of victor-victim that we see the therapeutic models coming to be adopted in relation to veteran politics. So on the one hand, Croatian state legitimation invokes the homeland war, it celebrates this, and in that sense Croatia follows the well-established pattern of state legitimation based on a victorious national wartime narrative. However, a key aspect of Croatian statehood was less on the battlefield, but more related to diplomacy and international judicial intervention, which impacted on the national narrative. And in two senses. One, in terms of the ICTY's prosecuting policies, which in a certain sense delegitimise key Croatian national heroes and in particular working at the symbolic level. But in another sense, international policies had a direct impact on veterans, namely the reduction of the military, that in relation to Croatian veteran politics, the international demands on Croatia to reduce its military created potential tensions in circumstances of expectations of Croatia as a social state, Croatia as a welfare state. In other words, expectations in the population of the state providing welfare or employment. However, what we have, as indicated in previous panels, is not state building based on Keynesian models on productivism. We don't have state building in that sense. There isn't the expectation. We don't have strategies based on the state as the primary agent of economic development. So instead, what you have in terms of sort of certain tensions over Croatian state legitimation, the whole significance of the war narrative, the significance of war veterans, and in the context of requirements for demilitarisation, what you had was demobilised soldiers channelled into veteran pension claims. And the consequences of what's really striking about this rise of veteran pension claims is they particularly rise over the last decade. So not in '95, but actually they initially rise after 2000, and then in particular in the mid-2000s. So you now have approximately 70,000 veterans with a population of 4.5 million, and they approximately take up 10% of the budget. That incidentally is far larger than the number of veterans of a country like Israel. All right, so conclusions. One reading can be that international trauma advocacy has helped legitimise a parasitical sectional interests, undermining the country's national development. That the therapeutic paradigm has helped the country squander its resources supporting unproductive lifestyles of the minority at the expense of the rest. So in other words, a picture of a parasitical political economy strangling the country. But ironically, with Croatia waking up to the economic crisis, what's really striking is the solutions apparently revolve around therapeutically empowering, capacitating redundant workers. So not only has the Croatian state not yet addressed the question of veteran pensions, which are crippling the state budget, but yet more groups are being offered therapeutic solutions to their lives. Now I'm about to run out of time, but just to miss out a whole section and just to end, there's a whole question of to what end. See, in the 1980s, the context of deindustrialisation in Britain, sort of post the miners' strike, saw the state massively expanding incapacity benefits. And we can parallel that to what's happened with the Croatian veterans. However, that possibility of expanding incapacity benefit to these industrial workers, newly unemployed, isn't possible to the Croatian state a decade on. Nor indeed, and people earlier spoke about capacitating individuals to be able to realise their own sort of micro enterprises, sort of a la Sen's development as freedom. But as we know from next door Bosnia, there's a major microcredit crisis paralleling the broader international subprime lending. So finally, what we seem to be seeing is interventions empowering the capacity of the individual to manage their own unemployment, to manage their own needs, relations and emotions. But essentially, this represents occupational therapy for the interveners.
Our second speaker is Dr. Jelena Obradović-Wojcik from Aston University, and the title of the presentation is Serbian Civil Society as an Exclusionary Space, NGOs, the Public, and Coming to Terms with the Past.
Okay, thank you. I'm just wondering where to begin, actually, because I've just been hearing so many interesting things today. And I think one of the things I can contribute perhaps to this conference is a discussion of these local ownership questions, and perhaps to illustrate this with something of a case study, let's say, for a couple of things that we might have heard today. And this is actually the tension within different local interpretations of a similar issue. That may or may not relate to state building. I'm actually very conscious now how I use these terms because I've just been hearing so many conceptual definitions of everything. So I'll be very careful. And the other issue that I perhaps might illustrate as well is this question of hidden transcripts that Gazim so well illustrated so nicely this morning. And I'm going to begin actually now by backtracking and actually explaining where this research is situated. And as the title of course indicates, I carried out my research in Serbia, and this is all based on ethnographic research, so it's very, very detailed, very much getting at the very bottom layer that we referred to this morning as well, David. So I did this ethnographic research, and it was actually related in a very, very brief sort of description of it, is that I looked at how people in Serbia cope with, talk about, understand, discuss or don't discuss the violent past. And of course the violent past relating to Bosnia, Kosovo and Croatia and the conflicts there. And of course the issue really that is actually very problematic for all of those violent pasts is that the conflicts, of course, involved a lot of Serbian atrocities carried out against civilians and military personnel of Croatia, Bosnia and Kosovo, so the conflicts and atrocities in short. And for many years now, we've been hearing this question of reconciliation, of coming to terms with the past. This is a narrative that is developed in Serbia. So I looked at this, and then I wanted to sort of juxtapose that with, or contrast it actually, with the way in which agents or local NGO agents and civil society actors actually interpret this project, and how it's very, very different to the ways in which the non-active ordinary populations, for the want of a better word, actually understand the same thing. And all of this, of course, belongs to the realm of transitional justice. Now, transitional justice is, of course, a set of legal procedures or proceedings, very often legal, but sometimes can be a little bit broader than that, that advocates this idea that we must enable societies that have come through very violent histories or very repressive histories to actually engage actively with their past, to confront it, and actually sort of close that chapter by coming to terms with it. I think it's very obvious that actually transitional justice has this kind of practical element to it, which is this legal aspect, as in truth commissions, war crimes trials, and so on. But at the same time, it has actually adopted this transformative element. So it's actually often implemented for the purpose of transforming a society. And this is very clearly actually indicated in some, projects of transitional justice, such as the court for former Yugoslavia at The Hague, the War Crimes Court, the ICTY, which actually states that our purpose is to collect all of these testimonies and then to make sure that people know the facts so that they will never be able to deny the past and therefore reconcile. So this is very much sort of encapsulates the whole debate behind, or the whole rationale behind transitional justice. And although many variants have actually developed this approach across different regions and societies, in Serbia, the approach that has been adopted has been very much this classical view, a very narrow view of transitional justice, which is to say that, right, we will expose facts about the past, people will get to know them, and they will learn them and come to terms with it. This, of course, is very problematic. I'm sure that we can all kind of come up with different reasons as to why, but I don't want to kind of go into that. I just want to go straight into the Serbian sort of context in this case, and that is to actually talk about the role of the civil society in this. Transitional justice in general advocates that actually civil society has an important role to play in the whole process, because they will hold governments accountable. In Serbia, the civil society, in the disguise or as NGOs, as active academics, anti-war protesters, people who are organized around a particular group or particular groups of NGOs, have actually fulfilled that role quite well. So, because the Serbian state was completely disengaged from this process of doing anything at all with the past for a very long time, and then kind of fulfilling its obligations to the court in a very reluctant manner, the NGOs then sort of went about holding governments accountable for this. But along the way, they incorporated the public into their project as well. So they're very, very clear in that. They're very clear on the fact that they want to engage the public in these debates about the past. And the public, and I sort of say this in quotation marks, is never really actually explicitly stated in these projects, who they are and what their job is actually in all of this. But nevertheless, the projects carry on, and year after year we hear the same thing. The public is failing to engage with the past, and the public hasn't come to terms with it. And this is despite the fact that many of these NGOs and projects actually are at pains to point out that their projects are not actually, how can we put it, they're not sort of an end goal. They always emphasize that this is a process, but nevertheless they kind of backtrack on that all the time, and they treat it as if it's something that we can sort of see whether it's happened or not, or have they confronted the past or haven't they. So this is the approach that sort of has been taken, really. Now, my sort of contribution to this has been to really identify the fact that even though different approaches to the past or engaging the public on the past exist within different NGOs, right? They still form a more or less of a coherent dominant discourse on what confrontation is or should be. And that is very clear. They're explicit about the fact that it has to be one thing. You have to be able to publicly come out and say, I acknowledge, atrocities that the Serbs committed in these wars. And this really fits quite well with this whole, actually partly with what Vanessa discussed, the therapeutic kind of background to all of this. And this is the fact that for the several decades that transitional justice has actually existed, it has really been underpinned by therapy, or the ideas about therapy, justice, forgiveness, and it's very much related to human rights and the discourse about this. And of course, it's seen as absolutely crucial in terms of state building, that societies have to do this in order to be consolidated democracies. Despite the fact that this approach, which is sort of testimony, truth-based, and very much based on public sort of exposition of this, despite the fact that this has been very criticized in various other contexts across the world, in Latin America, in Africa particularly, no one has actually really criticized it in a Serbian context, and it's actually used as something that is predetermined. It exists, right? The truth about the past exists, that's fine, and the only way to confront it is by doing this. So it's very much like a discourse that regulates responses of people. So if they have any other response to the past that doesn't conform to this, they're immediately excluded from the debate. And the public, in that sense, the mystical public, is treated as sort of like a lump of people that doesn't really have any, that word agency, in terms of creating their own narrative about what happened and how to actually confront it. So this is, I think, the problematic issue, that actually it's the response of the public, which, by the way, is not usually researched, is problematized in these approaches, rather than the approach itself. So the issue really has been, for the last, let's say, 10 years in Serbia, to engage a project to say, well, let's convert the public. This is effectively sort of at the bottom of all of this. Let's convert as many people as possible so they can come out and talk about this. And the NGOs, for their part, they work very, very hard at actually trying to put on public displays, movies, tribunals, what's the word, discussions. And they invite the public to this. And of course, the public doesn't do it. The public does not engage. Ordinary people have preoccupations that just have nothing to do with this. So as a result, their absence and their silence is seen as A, a denial of the past, or B, as a lack of information about the past. And so the cycle carries on. Now, my view here is really that I think the way in which the public is treated is deeply problematic, because not only do they not have any agency in this, or not seen as sort of actors that have agency, they're passive. They're just receivers of information about the past, and they have nothing valid to say until they've come to this realization that what we're saying is the right thing. They also don't even have a name, for want of a better word. So the Serbian public is always just treated as they, them, the public, it. They're not victims, they're not bystanders, they're not perpetrators, but actually in the ethnographic reality, if we look at it from the bottom up, they could be any one of those things, and they actually claim for themselves at times all of those positions. So again, it's this question of assigning subjectivities that I think is quite problematic in this whole approach. And on the other, to extend that, I think assigning subjectivities is very apparent as well in literature on this. And if we look at the literature that deals with Serbia, Bosnia, and Kosovo, in terms of transitional justice, it's really, really varied. It's excellent, and it treats many different subjects across this issue. So how people talk about what's happening in schools, what are women doing, what are men doing, this kind of thing. And in Serbia, the majority of the literature that has come out in this field has basically been saying, well, why haven't people come to terms with the past? So again, it sort of adopts that approach that is that synthesizes the narrow view of transitional justice, and the NGO, the practical approach of it, is actually synthesized with the academic as well. And of course, that in itself is not really a bad thing, but this is what the literature is at the moment. So we haven't really kind of moved on beyond that. And again, this, from what I can actually sort of see in transitional justice literature, is quite common, because across different geographical regions, critical scholars have actually said that this is, it's common because academics are frequently activists and vice versa, and so a lot of people end up sort of being advocates for the practice rather than actually researching what is going on. And in general, the research sort of has been quite lacking in terms of how transitional justice mechanisms are received, understood, and so on by local populations. So I hope that my own research actually contributed to this gap really in Serbia. But to now go into the, I have to check the time, I don't know how much.
4 minutes.
Oh, 4 minutes, okay. So to kind of go into the heart of what I actually discovered, was that actually if we take this approach that we explore these issues from the bottom up, so we start digging at the very bottom, and we take the time to discover where narratives about the past actually are situated. You know, they can't be forced out. You know, you can't sit someone down and say, oh, tell me what you believe about the past. Where I actually discovered that quite a lot of the silence that surrounds war crimes and the war in Serbia is not a silence that means, you know, forgetting, or a silence which has been actually called hate silence in Serbia by certain activists. It's actually nothing to do with that. It really covers up a lot of different dynamics, including things like, well, you know, people are just unable to talk about this. They're, you know, so shocked and traumatized by certain acts and activities that took place during, you know, the past that they're unable to actually verbalize it. And there's a huge literature as well actually dealing with the inability to speak about violence. And I think then this is also where perhaps the discipline of the practice and the scholarly discipline of transitional justice can perhaps turn inwardly as well and have a look at you know, our own kind of view of this, because I think we kind of assume that it's really easy for people to talk about this. And you know, we have the luxury of kind of hiding behind these euphemisms. You know, we talk about war crimes, right? When we write about this, you know, we don't talk about rape and murder and things like that. So in a sense, there is that issue to be explored as well. The transitional justice really, for something that is so reliant on language and testimony and speaking, really, really neglects this question of how violence and language are related, right? And finally, just to kind of conclude this, I borrowed, actually, in trying to understand this, I borrowed Lena Hansen's idea of the silent dilemma, and she talks about this, a silent dilemma in security. And my own view is that here there's something to be said for the silent dilemma in transitional justice, particularly when it tries to employ normative sort of practices or very, very kind of normative discourses that regulate responses of people. Because when that happens, then not only does it not understand the silence that sort of ensues that people kind of take part in, but also people silence themselves. Then the more that they see that they're being moralized by these, you know, the NGOs, the groups and so on, the more they wish to then disengage from the whole thing, because they see that their responses are unwelcome. So in a sense, the current practice is basically saying, well, you know, convert your opinion or change your opinion and then talk to us about it publicly, and then, you know, you'll be included, or we'll just, you know, exclude you further. And again, this is, I have to point out, this is not new actually in Serbia. This has actually already been noted in places like Argentina as well. And so this is, I think, where these hidden transcripts, Gazim, come in. I think we have to really be very careful that we don't obliterate them completely by just taking one singular approach to this issue of the past, because the past is so problematic as well, and it's not singular, it's not monolithic, and neither is people's actually experience of it. And I think the problem really is that the current approach can't really account for that, rather than kind of the problem being the people's sort of the response. So I think I'll just sort of leave it there. I've left a lot of things sort of lightly touched upon, but I don't want to go off into another point and then not conclude by the end. So I'll leave that there. Thanks.
Our last speaker is Dr. James Scarlinci from the London School of Economics, and the title is Self-Determination in Theory and Practice, Lessons from the Balkans.
Thank you very much, and well, thank you to Elisa and colleagues for arranging today. Sort of thinking very much when I was putting this title together, and like I think other panelists on this one, feeling a little bit mugged, I suppose, it might be a way of describing it, and sort of being very acutely aware of how approaching the subject. And I think really, rather than state building as such, what I was looking at, if you like, is the arguments that were built to justify the state in the case of Kosovo. And really where I was coming from was, there was a very, very telling comment made by a senior British diplomat, in fact, the British permanent representative to the United Nations in December 2007, a chap called Sir John Sawyers, who rather famously went on to become head of the British Intelligence Service, in which he made what really was a remarkable statement. He said, "You have the principle of territorial integrity. You also have the principle of self-determination. There are times when those principles are in tension with one another, and the principle of territorial integrity is qualified by the principle of self-determination." Now, anyone who's worked in the field of self-determination couldn't help but be struck by just how remarkable that statement was. And a couple of days later, I met with a few people from the Foreign Office, and I sort of said to them, look, did I hear this right? Their response was, he didn't mean it. We do not, under any circumstances, use the word self-determination in the context of Kosovo. We will avoid it at all costs. And really what this highlights is that there's this fundamental reading of how the notion of self-determination that exists in international politics. You know, very often people bandy it around, certainly sort of people who look at sort of international relations, without actually understanding how, if you like, diplomats, politicians view this concept, and they view it in extremely narrow terms. I won't go into the whole background about how the development of self-determination, how it evolved in the 19th century, early 20th century. I mean, obviously we had the Wilsonian notion of self-determination, but where I would really, I guess, start is by the post-Second World War conception of the term. And really it's come to be defined in very, very narrow terms. We have two essential conceptions of self-determination that are used in international law, international politics. That's internal and external self-determination. External self-determination is the self-determination that effectively leads to the creation of new states, independence. However, that's been defined essentially as falling under two basic conditions. That's processes of saltwater decolonization, and that's a very important distinction to make. I mean, decolonization, which really applied to the European colonial powers and applied to their territories in Africa and Asia. It doesn't apply to ideas of decolonization where a territory within established borders of a state might say, well, we were colonized by that state, we have a right to independence. Some fierce Scots nats, including my late father, used to make that justification for Scottish independence. It doesn't hold up. And then there was a notion of internal self-determination, which really applies in those sorts of cases where there is territory within a state where you have a distinct group of people who want a right of self-determination, and that's not based on a process leading to independence, but is about self-government of some sort or another. Now that can be constructed in any number of ways. There's all sorts of formulations that we can talk of: autonomy, federation, confederation, but essentially this is the sharp difference that is drawn, certainly at political levels and amongst international lawyers. And really this is the problem that in many ways was encountered in the case of Kosovo. Now, of course, a lot of people would say, well, what about the end of the Cold War? You know, these were notions, decolonization of the 1960s. But if you look at the cases that emerged at the end of the Cold War, in fact, they actually served to cement these notions of self-determination. So, for example, the breakup of Czechoslovakia was done on a consensual basis, and it was where there was a recognized right of the constituent parts to independence. So it wasn't about some part claiming that it had a right of independence contested. No, it was about two units which had sovereignty on the basis of past, and also a recognition of that this was a negotiated split between the two of them. The Soviet Union was a rather more interesting case because obviously this started with the Baltic republics and then spread out to the other republics. I won't go into a lot of detail now because I'm aware of a shorter time, but I'm quite happy to answer questions about that. And then of course you had Yugoslavia. And Yugoslavia was without a doubt the most problematic, and in order to try and answer the questions of how we best deal with the breakup of Yugoslavia, there was a commission that was formed by the European Union under a very eminent French jurist, the Badinter Commission, which exactly looked into this and was faced with a fundamental problem in the case of Yugoslavia, because under the 1974 constitution you had effectively a creation of a state where you had nations and you had republics, and they were given a right of self-determination. It was never entirely clear exactly who had that right of independence. I can go into more details about. There was also a category of nationalities which was very important. They were peoples who represented minorities who either had a home state which was outside of the six republics. So, for example, Albanians in Kosovo or Hungarians in Vojvodina, or were transnational communities. So you had, for example, the Roma, the Jewish community. The Ruthenians, for example, are a very interesting example in their own right. These were classed as nationalities. Then you had the Six Nations, which weren't regarded as having external homelands outside of Yugoslavia, and matched to the republics, and this was essentially the problem that we saw. But it was decided in the end that it was actually the right of self-determination, the right of independence lay with the republics, not with the nations. Following the breakup of those old established federations, I mean, we've seen other arguments about how we can regard self-determination. I think the most prominent example, for example, was Canada and the question of Quebec. And that set in place a number of very important rules that I think, you know, we are seeing even today, especially in the case of the debate over Scottish independence, which was the Clarity Act, which essentially laid down, if you like, a set of procedures which can lead to independence by territories, even if they don't have a basic right of external self-determination. That essentially, if there is a referendum, if it's a democratic process, and then this is followed by a process of negotiation, this can lead to independence. It doesn't close off. And so I think, you know, we are starting to see a development of certain ideas by which we can move away from this very traditional decolonialization process leading to independence. One thing that was brought up this morning and is raised very often is the idea of remedial secession. That at the moment has no legal groundings. There was the case on Kosovo that was brought before the ICJ, and one of the judges, Bruno Simmer, the German judge, actually called quite clearly. He called upon his colleagues to address this issue. They ducked out of this debate. Moving on to Kosovo, I won't go into all the historical background on that, but I think suffice it to say, for the purpose of these arguments, that in the process from 1995 to 1999, there were very clearly Serb atrocities that were committed there. I think this is very important for the argument that I'll make in a minute, and you know, this is not open to contestation. This is very clear. They've been recorded, and I think that, you know, all the evidence is there. You had 1999 NATO intervention, which obviously led to a period of UN administration. But I think it's very important to state that apart from a cadre of officials in the United States, in the State Department, there wasn't an overwhelming desire to see an independent Kosovo. Speaking with British officials about this, they've said, look, you know, as far as we were concerned, we understood what had happened in Kosovo. We wanted to ensure that Milosevic was forced from power. Then we hoped, ideally, that there would be a cooling off period for a few years, and then we could enter into some sort of political negotiations between Serbia and Kosovo, which would ideally have led to some sort of autonomous arrangement. In all likelihood, extremely high autonomy, but this was the hope. Maybe it would be an exaggeration to say it was the expectation, but this was certainly the hope of a lot of British officials, and was mirrored by a lot of other officials for the reasons that I'll go into in a minute. The trouble was that this was quite clearly unacceptable to the majority of citizens, people living in Kosovo, and so there had to be a way in which to square this circle, that they were demanding a right of self-determination, that this could only result in independence, but it was quite clear by this point that a process leading to independence would go against all the principles that the international community had worked in elsewhere. And so it was a way to get around this, that eventually somebody came up with the idea, okay, all right, what we'll do is we'll call this a unique case. We'll set it apart from all the principles and say that, you know, there were a number of circumstances that existed in Kosovo which sets it apart from any other situation. And essentially this was built on three core arguments. The first was on atrocities and human rights abuses, so hence why I wanted to make that point earlier. Again, this is not something that is denied. The trouble is that if this is applied in the case of Kosovo, then obviously one asks questions about the application of this principle in any number of other conflicts around the world. I lived for many years in Cyprus. I've worked extensively on the Cyprus issue. I saw at first hand the atrocities that had been committed there, the impact that this had had, especially on the Turkish Cypriot community from 1964 to 74. I'd seen also the effects of the Turkish invasion on the Greek Cypriot community. And yet, in that case, in 2004, I was living on the island when there was a referendum about reunification, and the Turkish Cypriots were being told that, look, we understood what happened to you in the 1960s, we understood the persecution you faced, and interestingly enough, in that case in 2004, the Greek Cypriot leader, the president of Cyprus, was somebody who'd been directly implicated in many of the worst atrocities in the 1960s. And the Turkish Cypriots were told, yes, that's all well and good, but you don't have a right to your own state. You've got to reunify with the Greek Cypriots. You can have a federal settlement, but this is the way that we're going to approach it. And you can look at any number of other cases. Kurdistan is another very, very obvious example of this, where the right of self-determination leading to independence has been effectively denied. And so I think the problem that one finds in the case of Kosovo is, as I say, this is not about trying to diminish the suffering that people in Kosovo undertook, but it's also about not saying that that should be elevated above the suffering of other communities elsewhere that would give them a right of independence that we don't extend to other peoples. The second argument is the 1974 Constitution, which I mentioned earlier, and that is very troubling in itself for a number of reasons. One, because of course this has been dealt with by the Badinter Committee arbitration in the early 1990s. They'd examined this case and had come out against a right of self-determination for sub-republic actors, so hence Vojvodina, Kosovo, but also for the nations and nationalities living externally. So for example, Serbs living in Croatia were not regarded as having a right of self-determination to unite territorially with Serbia. And so really the argument that the 1974 Constitution would allow Kosovo to become independent rather goes on, is an argument after the fact that it had already been examined, it had already been rejected. But also there's another argument, well, if that's the case, then what about Vojvodina, which held a comparable status with Kosovo in the former Yugoslavia? So you have the 6 republics, and then you have these 2 provinces, Vojvodina in northern Serbia, Kosovo in southern Serbia. And the second you mention a notion of an independent Vojvodina, people get very, very nervous about it, and diplomats say, no, Vojvodina won't become independent, it mustn't become independent. And at the time of the discussions over Kosovo, the German ambassador in Belgrade actually mentioned this, and I think regretted it for the rest of his career, sadly regretted it for the rest of his life. He died a few years later, and I think a lot of people felt that it was partly as a fallout of this comment that he made one afternoon, which caused absolute panic. The German Parliament actually insisted that he answer for this statement to them, because it was seen as such a serious statement and would actually encourage Serb fears that Kosovo was just the next stage in the gradual breakup of Yugoslavia. And so it's very, very interesting that the argument of the 1974 Constitution is only applied in the case of Kosovo, but isn't actually applied in a number of other examples in the former Yugoslavia and even in Serbia. Okay. The third element in all of this is that Kosovo had a period of UN administration. And this is one of the arguments, this is the third, as I say, why it's a unique case. Again, if we follow that line of thinking, then it becomes extremely troubling. The Cypriot delegation to the International Court of Justice explained very, very clearly why this was the case. That if you then start to say that because the territory has undergone a period of UN administration, that this gives it then a right of independence following that, you're going to close off the door for the UN to be able to act in any number of other circumstances. Countries just simply aren't going to allow the UN in if they believe that this is going to be the first step leading to independence. There's also the question that isn't brought up this morning about reading UN Security Council resolutions, and I think that this is, in the case of Kosovo, Resolution 1244, there was a certain element of constructive ambiguity that was built into it. If you then start to say, well, we've got to then close off all avenues as a result of this, because of what's happened in Kosovo, I think we're going to find that it becomes extremely difficult for the UN to be able to act in other circumstances, because the Security Council is going to have to come up with a very, very clear, agreed definition of what they mean, and not closing off avenues. So, for example, the Brazilian and the Argentinians, who both spoke at the ICJ case on Kosovo and who were members of the Security Council in 1999, stated categorically, as far as they were concerned, the references to Kosovo and the territorial integrity of Yugoslavia, I can go into questions about how Yugoslavia and Serbia related to each other in these legal debates, meant that any future settlement would not lead to independence. And they were certain of this. But of course Britain, France and other countries, which are the United States, which were on the Security Council in 1999, said, well, no, we felt that it was open, and we can interpret it in this way. And I think that's very, very important. The UN actually has that ability to be able to act. So where does this lead us, this problem with the unique case argument? I think there's two aspects to this. There's the international aspect, and then there's a very specific regional Kosovo aspect. And I'll just very briefly touch on the international and then conclude with the Kosovo and the state building issues. I think the general problem that we see is that this has created, if you like, a problem in international politics, where it seems in the case of Kosovo, it's a case of a certain number of countries, mainly Britain, France, United States, Germany, telling the rest of the world, do as we say, not do as we do, that no one else has a right of self-determination. Kosovo was a unique case. Why? Because we said it was so, but you don't have the right to determine equally when another situation falls into a unique case category. And I think we can already have seen the fallout of this, the most obvious example of which was Russia's actions in the case of Georgia in 2008. Wherever one stands on this, it's very, very apparent that Russia took the example of Kosovo and said, look, if you could do it in the case of Kosovo, then we can do it in this case. And I think looking into the future, this will potentially become a problem in a number of other cases, that Kosovo becomes a dangerous precedent for that reason. And it is certainly seen as a model by various other separatist groups, the idea that it's just a unique case and it doesn't apply to anyone else. Well, I mean, we are seeing the language of Kosovo brought up in any number of other cases. Some there is a very clear parallel, some it's more tenuous, but it's there. Interesting enough, in relation to Palestine, the Kosovo argument is used there, when in actual fact, I think under international law, that the argument is Palestine actually has a far greater case to statehood than Kosovo. But to conclude on the basis of some ideas, if you like, of what this might affect the process of state building in Kosovo, this process of leading to its independence, the sui generis argument. I think it's made it a lot more difficult for Serbia to accept a state of Kosovo, because they feel they've been unfairly picked upon by in this process. That why is it the case that they've lost Kosovo when Iraq hasn't lost Kurdistan, that Cyprus hasn't lost northern Cyprus, that Georgia hasn't lost South Ossetia and Abkhazia, and that is very, very important, this sense of resentment that one feels in Serbia. I think there's a great deal of pragmatism, actually, amongst most Serbs that I've spoken to about Kosovo. They recognise that it's lost, but they do feel deeply resentful about the way it was lost. And I think that this is a major obstacle. And I think it's also having an effect on the way that the Serbs in northern Kosovo respond to Pristina. I think also this idea that it's a unique case, that there can't be any more self-determination, and let's face it, this is exactly what it was in this case, is also closing off avenues for other potential solutions to the situation in Kosovo. So, for example, we do have a problem with regard to the north. Many people have suggested that there could be some sort of territorial readjustment. I think that this is, in many ways, is a very logical solution to the situation, but that's been completely closed off as a result of this process. And I think that in terms, that also has a knock-on effect in other ways, that the North has now become a very, very useful excuse for the government, the authorities in Pristina, to blame failure to develop in any number of other areas. We haven't got control over the North. No one really explains why not having control over the North doesn't lead to developments elsewhere in Kosovo, but this is the mantra of the administration. And again, I mean, Cyprus is a very, very telling example of this. 36% of the territory was lost in 1974. Up until rather recently, Cyprus was well regarded on the international stage as rather an economic miracle that had overcome a significant loss of its territory and moved on and actually managed to develop very, very strongly. So I don't see where that argument has particular strength. I think in actual fact, any sense of trying to control the North actually is likely to be more problematic for the state building process in Kosovo. I think it's also fueled a rather uncompromising and hard line. I've got one more after this and be quick. Hard line form of politics in Kosovo, because the split of Kosovo from Serbia was not a consensual split. It wasn't a negotiated split. Now, all sorts of arguments could be made, well, Serbia would never agree, but I don't think that was the case. I think that in certain corridors of power, especially President Tadic has stated before the Security Council, well, why don't we have a transitionary period of 20 years under which Kosovo is given substantial autonomy and then there can be a referendum? That would have been open to negotiation, and the most obvious case where that was used, and very, very successfully used, of course, was South Sudan, which became independent last year. And then I think finally, and potentially controversially, I think this whole process, because it went outside of the established parameters of international law, has perhaps also shaped the attitudes of many of the leaders in Kosovo towards the nature of the rule of law and the significance and importance of law. You very often hear people talk, well, the UN doesn't matter. Why should we want to be a part of the UN? The UN's blocked us from getting statehood because of the Security Council. And I think that there is a danger that this is actually having a knock-on effect. And obviously open and would like to hear ideas on that. So really it's just to say that what we saw in the case of Kosovo, this unique case argument, really did challenge many of the established principles, tenets of international law, and I think has created certain circumstances that actually not only have spillover effects more widely in international politics, but are also hindering the full and effective development of Kosovo as a state. Thank you.
I just would like to thank the department to start with, and also the participants and the guest speakers for kindly agreeing to present today. But in general, I mean, as much as we have this love-hate relationship with creating overarching meta-narratives, I'm going to try and draw some sort of sense into what we did today. And thank you, because what this conference and what your presence suggests is that actually the interest in state building is by no means subsumed, and to no degree has it actually become a stale concept or an uncritical practice. As a field of research, most scholars or students will once in their lives cross paths with state building, as it's one of the most multidisciplinary, multifaceted elements of international relations. Now, today's conference is not only a success because, of course, we managed to bring together scholars of all levels and all calibers to the discussion, but also because the debates sparked during the discussions demonstrate that there is no such thing as the end of history in scholarship, nor particularly in regards to state building. And it's actually quite the opposite. The contribution to today's conference unmistakably indicates that there's wide space for explanation and inquiry into the sociological as well as the political nature of state building today. From questioning the role of international community in international state building mission to interrogating what happens after the conflict is over. The reach of the research that has been presented here today has touched upon theory and practices of state building equally. The sociological framing adopted through the conference has allowed us to look into the direction of the research dedicated to empowerment, resilience, localization, societal forms of state building as a means to redress the problems of institutionalist state buildings of the 90s. New sociological framings have turned the vigilant eye of the scholarship towards the local conditions and the rise of governance. Vanessa's paper has, for example, examined the rising tension between the national and international positions to the question of post-war veteran politics, with a particular focus on the reality in Croatia. Jelena similarly dismisses the role of liberal understandings of post-war civil society initiatives by claiming to step away from elitist NGOs-led understanding of civil justice towards a post-liberal social understanding of the role of civil society in the context of Serbia. What arises is thus basically what David has called a biopolitical society, wherein the political is absorbed within the social, where democracy is not merely the exercise of power, but the capacity to limit and disperse it. But my question here today would be, well, where does the political go? Other than what is the political? And we've talked about what is the social, but we haven't quite discussed what we think the political might be. So where does it go? Jonathan's contribution seems to indicate that it doesn't disappear through the absorption of the social, but that these new forms of governance are promoted as new types of social relations, and they still present underlying interests and power asymmetries, which are renewed over and over again. The rise of the social creates forms of space and mode of governance, as Patricia has discussed earlier, in relation to population-centric counterinsurgency, which conflates realpolitik and socialpolitik as a form of social regulation. Neither is the rise of social completely unproblematic in the context of state building. As these sociological framings of self-determination have shifted the balance away from legalist understanding of self-determination and towards self-determination as empowerment and capacity to govern, practical considerations are still evident, and James' contribution has highlighted some questions with regard to self-determination and what happens to redefinition of self-determination in the case of state disintegration. So where is the political? I mean, the shift from state-centered security to societal security has not been without problems, and you guys have today time and time again told us that there are problems with this shift towards the social. You've warned us about the failure to impose multicultural framework in Kosovo, and Marius has done this earlier on. And you've also warned us about the risk-averse nature of state building, which results in overshadowing political and economic issues in certain communities, and Kustrim has done that. We've heard about how the shift of societal security and subsequent adaptation of UN mandates has changed the nature of state building in the case of Haiti, and Zoe has done that. Or how changing perception of success and failure in Northern Ireland have moved the focus on formal state institution, but that is still coming through, and that is still paramount, and Branka has discussed this. Equally, we've been warned of the end result of this shift from state to societal state building by looking at how the outcome is actually far from organic state building. And Allah has discussed this in relation to Palestine, and how Fayyadism hasn't actually translated into any form of organicity. And this has been argued, is evident also in the cases where this turn towards the social conceals even greater exercises of authority and control of resources, and Marta's done this in relation to Congo. Equally, we remain wary of exclusionist practices which continue to exist despite the change, and Audrey has discussed this in relation to the continuous exclusion of gendered issues in state building across times. And through these inquiries, we've also been advised to look at the current limitations of state building in practice, such as the case of exploring what happens when we don't consider unintended consequences, and Gazim has done this very well at the beginning of the day. And finally, we have all agreed to look at the limitations of state building in theory, to look at the construction of the social and the role of the political, to assess whether the two are mutually exclusive, whether they conflate, or whether they exist in parallel universes, if you will. To look at the shift towards the social, and to question the role of agency, and to influence, and the influence of this in relation to history and continuity. Now, the voice of the social may no longer be ignored, and this far we've understood today. But if such transformation to the social is absolute and undeniable, are we then witnessing the death of the political? This is the question that we want to bring forward. Or could we consider that the rise of the social, the shift to the social, the push for transformation and empowerment is actually the new highest expression of the political? So I'll leave it at that unless my colleagues want to...
Just to add a small comment, it's something that the organizers, we found that it was missing. It was the fact that some of us have been talking about state building, how it's a discourse of authority, of power, how it reinforces gender inequality, how it has failed in many places. Then there is a timid answer there, which is that it is a hybrid form of peace. Be aware of the complexity of the process, resilience, adaptation, power to the locals. Then there is the critique of this, and say that this is nothing new, that this is actually the mainstream discourse. That hybridity, resilience, and biopolitics is already there. Then our concern was that our critique might head backwards rather than forward. One of the cliches of our times is the term crisis, and I will add, after this conference, also the terms complexity, critique, failure, pessimism. And I will finish with another cliche, but one that is absolutely necessary, I think, which is that a lot has been said about the past, but what about the future of state building? And if we are not able to envision a vision of the future of state building, who can? Well,
And yeah, I just want to briefly maybe escalate the critique of Paul a little bit. So
my concern is that maybe we need to take the research a little bit beyond the question whether the state and local society fit or don't fit, and how well prescriptive models and the local are a misfit, and to the extent whether there's a rhetoric reality gap. And I think and I completely agree with Jonathan that what has been missing is sort of the state building in the context of alleged global problems and global processes of globalization. And I think the idea of network and complexity and all these things, they need to be taken into account. So I think sometimes we launch our critique maybe a little bit on too easily on prefabricated assumption about what discourses we're actually looking at. And but also I'm a little concerned about critical approaches maybe, and I think this idea that either we have two options: either we do deep ethnography or deep genealogy, well, deep sort of tracing the discourses and go back into their original meaning. It all seems to be such a hunt backwards for any sort of meaning we might find in these concepts, rather than, and I think there used to be more, I don't know, a couple of years ago or like a couple of decades ago, those things were academic trench fights, and now we're like sort of really lost, and we don't actually sort of struggle over those concepts, rather than we struggle ourselves in terms of finding a meaning to them. And that in the context of the title of the conference, so I was thinking the social and the political, and I think that maybe needs to be addressed as well, because if we're talking about rights, we're not talking only about rights of the social, but also the rights of politics in mainstream discourses. So there's an increasing acknowledgement that state building is political, and that politics is a factor in the societies on the ground. So the question then is, what kind of notions of politics underpins this current revival of politics, and if so, is there a link between the rise of the social and the rise of politics? And if we say so, or if we come to the conclusion, then I'd say, maybe drawing a little bit on Hannah Arendt, then it does maybe speak for a certain loss of a shared reality and a certain world alienation that warns us of the dangers of unforeseeable consequences of engagement, and I think that makes our epistemological and conceptual problems that we're struggling with and the tools we're losing even more problematic in the face of this sort of policy discourse that tells us that we're lost in a world that we can't control anymore. So I think there's a real problem here with this sort of world alienation and the loss of a shared reality, because it comes also, I think, and the hidden transcripts plays into this, and I think the Western self-critique as well. So I think that the truth of the other lies in the hidden transcripts. Is maybe a sort of alienation from the other as well, and a sort of we don't know how the other relates to the world, that we don't know what we're dealing with anyway. So his or her engagement with the world lies so hidden that it's beyond our engagement and our grasping, and that of course relates then to the self, because if we do not understand the hidden transcripts of the others, so our own experience can only come into play as cognitive deficits, and we only can lack local knowledge, and all we are is lacking. So actually that used to be the post-colonial subject, and now we are the lacking subject. Thank you very much for coming.